They called her Isolde of the Iron Heart, a countess born under a night of blackened moons, when even the owls dared not cry and the dogs hid from the wind. They said the midwife wept when she held the child, for Isolde's eyes were dark as congealed blood, and in that gaze the woman saw futures she would rather forget. Yet to the nobles of the land, the child was a jewel, heir to House Valengarde, a fortress of stone and pride overlooking 1,000 dying villages. The peasants whispered that Isolde never cried as an infant, that no milk could soothe her, only the taste of something salt and red upon her lips. These were peasants' tales, born of hunger and terror, but as the years turned like the rusting gears of a gallows, the rumors became harder to deny. For when the girl was 5, a maid vanished in the night, and the only trace of her was a pale scrap of cloth clenched in Isolde's tiny hand spotted with stains the priests tried to wash away. The count, her father, silenced the gossip with coin and blade alike, for House Valengarde could not bear a scandal. Yet what no dagger could kill was the look in Isolde's eyes as she grew, a look of hunger deeper than any banquet could calm. In the paintings of that era, she stands with her raven dark hair, the perfect silhouette of a noble lady. But if one peers closer, the portrait seemed to ripple with something hidden, something devouring. Those who lived to serve her told of restless nights, of how she would wander the corridors barefoot, seeking any sound, any trembling voice, until his servant was left alone and unguarded. They spoke in hushed tones of how she would press close, inhaling their scent, as though trying to memorize the terror that rose from their skin. Then came the winter of 1512, so cold the river itself turned to a blade of ice, and the castle was locked away from the world. Famine tore through the land, peasants starved, and behind the walls of Valengarde, fear walked with every footstep. Isolde had been married that year to a man twice her age, a warlord who prized cruelty above all else. Yet he was soon laid low by a mysterious fever after only 9 nights in her bed. Some said it was poison, others said it was her hands that stilled his breath, for no one heard him scream as he died. When they buried him, Isolde stood above the coffin, silent, lips stained with something redder than wine, a vision so strange the priests crossed themselves in secret. With her husband gone, she ruled Valengarde alone, and as the famine deepened, so too did her darkness. She forbade the castle gates to open, hoarding what little food remained, until even the servants began to waste away. It was then, so the legend goes, that she summoned her steward in the dead of night and asked him a question so gentle it chilled him to the marrow. "Tell me, old friend, how does fear taste upon the tongue?" He dared not answer. She smiled, a smile so lovely it made men forget their mother's prayers, and told him to bring her a maid from the scullery, one who was young and trembling and so thin the bones showed through her skin. The steward obeyed, for who can deny a countess? When the girl was led to Isolde's chamber, no one ever saw her leave. The next day, Isolde appeared at the feast, her cheeks flushed, her lips glistening, as if she had sipped some forbidden nectar. And thus began the darkest chapter in the chronicles of House Valengarde, for each night another servant vanished, another set of pale bones buried under the orchard soil. They say Isolde grew fairer with every disappearance, her skin luminous, her eyes brighter, until no one could meet her gaze without shuddering. Some claimed it was witchcraft, that she had bargained with devils beneath the castle stones, but others whispered an even more dreadful suspicion, that she consumed their flesh, piece by piece, to feed a hunger older than reason itself. And still no one dared challenge her, for the land outside the walls was a graveyard, and within, her iron heart ruled with a velvet smile. Even the priest who came to bless the dead found himself beguiled by her beauty, unable to speak the words of God, as if his tongue had been taken by her spell. And so the nights rolled on, thick with the scent of tallow and rotting wood, while Isolde of the Iron Heart walked the halls in silence, choosing her next offering to whatever horror coiled inside her soul. The villagers could only pray lighting candles until their hands bled, for they knew no saint would dare pass those gates. No savior would come through snow and plague to free them from a mistress who fed upon her own. The legend holds that she believed human fear was a delicacy, that the meat alone was not enough unless it had been salted with mortal terror. She would speak to her victims as they wept, soothing them like a mother, letting them hope for mercy until the very moment her teeth touched their skin. This, they said, was how the Countess of Valengarde made herself ageless, how she became a spirit walking in flesh, a phantom in brocade. And though no law could touch her, the servants began to vanish faster, for she no longer cared to hide. In that winter, the walls of Valengarde became a tomb, the hearths grew cold, and behind each heavy oak door, a shadow waited with a blade. She was no longer a woman, but a hunger-given form, an ancient darkness crowned in pearls and velvet, and as the snow piled higher, it seemed the world itself held its breath, wondering if even God had abandoned those stone walls forever. In the depths of that winter while famine gnawed, and the land lay still as a corpse, the rumors of Isolde's atrocities found their way to the ears of a wandering friar named Tomas, a man who had once studied in the libraries of Florence and believed no evil was beyond redemption. He came to Valengarde with a cross of carved yew and words of blessing upon his lips, but the villagers dared not follow him past the iron gates. Alone, he crossed into a place where even the ravens no longer perched. Within the halls he saw tapestries, rotting from neglect, candles burned low, and the faces of the few remaining servants drawn and gray as funeral cloth. They would not speak to him, only bowed their heads as if a chain hung about their souls. Tomas demanded audience with Isolde, and she granted it at once, for perhaps in her hollow heart still flickered the curiosity of a predator drawn to new prey. She met him in a great chamber hung with green velvet, sitting upon a throne of dark oak so ancient it seemed grown from the grave itself. She wore a gown the color of fresh blood, and at her throat glimmered a pendant of onyx, cut sharp as a dagger. Her beauty was unearthly, unmarred by the grief and pestilence that had devoured the land outside her gates. "Welcome, holy man," she purred, and the sound of her voice was like silk pulled across a blade. Tomas, though steady of heart, felt a chill pass through him, as if he stood before a thing older than sin. He spoke of God's mercy, of salvation, of the sanctity of life, yet all the while she watched him with a kind of amused hunger, eyes lingering on the flutter of his pulse at the base of his throat. At last she rose, a slow, graceful unfolding, and came to stand so close he could smell the faint iron tang clinging to her skin. "Tell me, father," she whispered, "do you think God weeps for those who taste such terror?" Tomas tried to answer, but his tongue would not obey him, trapped by the ice of her gaze. She reached out, brushing a single finger along his jaw, and in that instant he felt as if the whole world had shrunk to the space between her lips and his fear. She laughed softly, a sound more terrible than any scream, and stepped back. "You are welcome here," she said, "as long as you wish to stay. My house is always hungry for prayers." But he knew then there would be no prayers strong enough, no candle bright enough, to banish what lived in her soul. That night, Tomas was shown to a guest chamber. Its walls hung with icons, but the faces of the saints seemed to weep blood in the candlelight. Sleep came only in fitful moments, for he heard sounds in the dark beyond the door, a woman sobbing, the scrape of something heavy dragged across the stones, and once a high thin voice singing lullabies in a language he did not know. When dawn broke, a servant with hollow eyes brought him stale bread and watered wine, refusing to meet his gaze. Tomas knew then he could not flee. To leave was to bring the wrath of Valengarde upon the village outside, for Isolde's power had grown monstrous, unchecked. He would have to find a way to end her, but how does one kill a legend? How does one destroy a hunger that wears a human face? As days bled into nights, Tomas studied her, watching her walk the halls like a queen of the underworld, never aging, never tiring, each night a new victim drawn behind her chamber doors. He learned that she kept a hidden passage beneath the great hearth, a narrow stairway leading into a crypt older than the castle itself. Some said it had once been a temple to forgotten gods, a place where blood sacrifice had long been offered. There, he realized, was the root of her power, the place where she fed the darkness that clung to her bones. And so, he gathered what courage he possessed, clutching his simple yew cross, and one night followed her as she slipped down the hidden stair. The air was thick with the stink of old blood and damp stone. Candles guttered in the stale breath of the crypt, painting monstrous shadows along walls etched with runes no priest would dare read aloud. There, Isolde knelt beside a great stone bowl, its rim stained dark, and Tomas saw her lift a chalice to her lips, its contents so red they seemed to glow. Her face was radiant in that moment, a terrible goddess, a blasphemy made flesh. He could not look away. She drank deeply, sighing as though from some unearthly pleasure. And the bones of a child lay scattered at her feet, tiny and pale against the black floor. Tomas' heart nearly broke, but he stepped forward. In the name of God, he called, voice trembling, I command you to stop. Slowly, she turned to him, her lips crimson, and for a heartbeat he saw something almost human in her eyes, a flash of pain, perhaps, or memory, but then it was gone, devoured by a smile that had nothing of mercy in it. You should have stayed in your village, she breathed and rose to her full height, taller than he had thought, the air around her shimmering with a heat that smelled of copper and graveyards. The cross shook in his hand. He began to pray, words crashing from his mouth in a river of Latin, but she advanced, each step soft as a cat, until she reached him and laid a finger on the wood. And in that instant, the prayers died, for he felt a surge of horror, a knowledge that no god would hear him here, beneath these stones. This place, she said, belongs to older powers than yours, priest. Then she leaned close, lips brushing his ear, and whispered a single word so violent burned across his mind like hot iron. Tomas fell to his knees, shaking, and felt the world slip sideways, as though all that was good had fled his heart. She stepped past him then, serene as a bride on her wedding day, and lifted the child's bones in her hands. Cradling them to her breast, she began to sing, a lullaby older than any scripture, and the stones themselves seemed to echo with her terrible song. Tomas, broken, wept, for he knew there would be no saving her, no saving the souls devoured by the Lady of Valengarde, and no salvation for himself in that place of endless night. In the days that followed, Tomas wandered the halls of Valengarde like a spectre himself, half mad with grief and terror. The prayers that once steadied his heart had turned to ashes on his tongue, and each time he tried to lift the cross, he felt Isolde's whispered word coil around his spirit, a serpent whose poison dulled his courage. At night, she called for him, summoning him to sit at her table. She dined upon food no servant dared taste, rich meats gleaming with strange glazes, red wines darker than any vineyard could yield. Always there was that scent, faint and metallic, beneath the perfumes of rose and sandalwood. She would speak to him of poetry, of the constellations, of the philosophies she had learned from scholars long dead, her mind a brilliant, terrible mirror reflecting both grace and rot. Yet in her every word, he felt the pulse of something ancient, a hunger far older than any kingdom. Once, as he struggled to keep his eyes open through her soft, hypnotic voice, she leaned forward and asked him so gently that it broke his soul, Father, have you ever tasted despair? Truly tasted it, as one tastes honey or wine? Tomas could not answer, for he realized he had begun to taste it himself, every hour he stayed in that cursed place. Still, in a corner of his mind, a tiny spark of resolve refused to die. Each day, he watched her, listening for any clue that she might be vulnerable, any sign of weakness in her rituals. The servants would not meet his eyes, but he saw how they trembled when she passed, like rabbits before the hawk's shadow. And he noticed something else, a pattern. Each night she slipped to the crypt, she took with her a drop of her own blood, pressed from her fingertip into the chalice before she drank. There, Tomas glimpsed a chance. Somewhere in the twisted rites, Isolde had to renew her link to that monstrous power with her own living blood. If he could break that chain, perhaps the darkness would release her or destroy her outright. So one night, he hid near the hearth before she descended, clutching a dagger blessed in secret with the last of the village's holy oils. The flames burned low, guttering in a sour-smelling wine, and when Isolde appeared, she seemed to float above the stones, so light, so otherworldly. Tomas saw how pale she had grown, how her veins shone blue through the fragile skin of her wrists, as though the blood she stole could no longer quite sustain her. He followed her down, his feet silent upon the stair, heart battering itself to pieces inside his ribs. The crypt was colder than a grave, lit only by the sickly glow of a dozen half-burned candles. Isolde knelt as always, slicing her fingertip, letting the drop fall into the chalice. Her voice rose in that awful lullaby, and Thomas could feel the bones of the earth itself shivering to hear it. He stepped forward, dagger ready, but in that moment she turned, as if she had always known he was there. "Why do you struggle, father?" she asked, and he saw no anger in her, only a weariness that was somehow worse than any hatred. "This world is already broken. Why deny me the small mercy I give them?" Thomas tried to lift the dagger, but his hand shook so violently it was as if the bones refused to obey him. She rose, still holding the chalice, and came so close he could smell the copper on her breath. "Do you think I wanted this?" she whispered. "Do you think I chose to be the knife of the old gods?" And for one heartbeat, Thomas saw it, the girl she might have been, long ago, before the hunger, before the night devoured her innocence. But the moment shattered as she smiled again, red and perfect and merciless. She raised the chalice to her lips. Thomas lunged. The dagger struck, catching her wrist, and the blood spilled not into the cup but across the stones. A scream like nothing human burst from her throat, a sound that clawed at the walls until the candles snuffed out, leaving them in crushing darkness. She dropped to her knees, clutching the wound, and Thomas saw the black veins spreading from where her blood touched the floor, like poison drawn into the roots of the earth. The crypt seemed to convulse, the runes on its walls flaring with a hellish light, as if the thing she had fed for so long was stirring from its slumber. Isolde looked up at him, eyes wide with something between terror and relief. "You fool," she gasped, "you have unchained it." The stones shook beneath their feet, a sound like 1,000 bones breaking at once echoing through the catacombs. Thomas tried to retreat, but the floor cracked, and a darkness deeper than night poured from the broken runes, swallowing candles, bones, even the iron gate itself. From that pit rose a shape, shifting and vast, crowned with horns and cloaked in the smell of centuries of rot. It looked upon them both, and the air turned so foul Thomas could barely stand. Isolde shrank from it, clutching her bleeding wrist, eyes wild. "Master," she tried to say, but the thing only laughed, a laugh that splintered the mind, made even the stones bleed. Then it spoke, a voice like knives drawn across tombstones. "You have served me well, child, but you are no longer needed." Isolde screamed as it reached for her, claws of living shadow closing about her shoulders, lifting her from the ground as though she weighed nothing. Thomas, half blind with horror, saw her eyes meet his one last time, filled with a terrible pleading. "Save me," she mouthed, but no sound came, for the thing was already tearing her away from her mortal shell. The Lady of Valengarde, who had once danced in silks and drunk the lifeblood of innocence, now howled like a lost child as the ancient darkness devoured her, stripping away her beauty, her power, everything but her raw, screaming soul. Then both she and the demon were gone, pulled into the pit, and the crypt was silent, but for Thomas's ragged breath. The candles flared to life again, guttering in an unnatural wind, and he saw that the stones were whole once more, no crack, no mark of what had happened, only the chalice lying empty, its rim stained with her blood. The silence in the crypt after the demon's departure was so complete Thomas thought he might have gone deaf. Every nerve in his body trembled with the memory of that impossible voice, the way it had split the very stones with its contempt. Slowly, shakily, he rose to his feet, the blessed dagger clutched in his hand, slick with Isolde's blood. A part of him still searched for her in the gloom, expecting to see her step forward, all regal darkness restored, but she was gone, erased as though she had never existed, leaving only the echo of her despair. Thomas climbed from the crypt as dawn began to pale the high windows, each step harder than the last, as though 100 years weighed on his bones. The halls of Valengarde had changed in a single night. The air seemed clearer, less stifling, and the fearful servants who crept from their hiding places looked about as though seeing the castle for the first time. Many wept openly, unable to believe they were free of her terrible reign. Some reached for Thomas, clutching his sleeves, begging him to bless them, to assure them it was truly over. He could offer them only a broken blessing, for his voice cracked with exhaustion, but the people clung to it nonetheless, desperate for any scrap of hope. Outside, the snows had begun to melt. Winter's icy claws loosened as if nature itself sighed in relief. Thomas stepped through the gatehouse, past guards who had forgotten how to raise their spears, and looked out over the village he had left behind. Its roofs were half collapsed from storms and rot, but here and there plumes of smoke curled skyward again as if people had found courage to relight their hearts. They watched him come down the hill, the priest who had walked into Valengarde's mall and survived, and though they dared not cheer, their eyes shone with something close to reverence. They asked him if the Countess was truly gone, if the rumors of her feeding on the blood of the innocent were ended, and Thomas told them quietly, honestly, that her evil had been swallowed up by a greater horror. The villagers trembled at that, but many nodded, for even the idea of a nameless demon seemed less frightening than living under the rule of Isolde's velvet smile. Days passed. Thomas helped bury the castle's dead, finding bones stacked behind walls and beneath floors, terrible proofs of how deeply her madness had rooted itself. The peasants reclaimed the land, sowing seed in fields that had known only salt and tares. In time, the banners of Valengarde were lowered and burned, and the fortress stood silent, a monument to a family line ended in blood. But Thomas could not rest. Night after night, he dreamed of the crypt, of Isolde's last look, the helpless plea in her eyes. Guilt gnawed at him. No matter how monstrous she had become, a part of her had still reached for mercy in her final moment. And he had failed her, had let the demon devour what might have been saved. He prayed for her soul in every chapel along the road, crossing himself until his shoulders ached, yet peace never came. One evening, as dusk bled across the hills, he sat alone by a dying fire, and tried to remember the girl they said she had once been, the laughing child, clever and curious, before the hunger took root. He wondered if there had ever been a chance for her, or if she had been damned the moment of her birth, chosen by some ancient cruelty to be a vessel for darkness. The thought haunted him as surely as any ghost, and sometimes when wind rattled the shutters and the embers flared in strange shapes, Thomas fancied he heard her voice again, soft and sorrowful, singing that lullaby from the crypt. He would close his eyes, letting the melody pierce his heart, wondering if she forgave him, wondering if forgiveness was even possible in a world that had birthed such nightmares. Word of what had happened at Valengarde spread far beyond its cold hills. Travelers brought tales of the priest who faced a demon and the lady who bathed in children's blood to keep her beauty. Most twisted the story, turning Thomas into a conquering hero, Isolde into a succubus from legend. He did not correct them. Truth was more complicated, more brutal than any fireside myth. In truth, he had destroyed a woman broken by ancient curses and unchained something worse that now slept somewhere waiting for another hungry soul to wake it. Thomas knew one day he might be called to face it again. Until then, he walked from village to village, carrying nothing but a staff and a prayer book, blessing the sick, comforting the dying, and telling them in gentle words that no darkness lasts forever. Yet in his own heart, he feared. For he had seen that darkness had 1,000 names, 1,000 faces, and could slip its claws into even the purest breast. Isolde had been proof of that. So he carried her story with him, a secret penance, a reminder of how easy it was for love to become hunger, for mercy to become cruelty, for beauty to rot behind a smile. And on certain nights, when the wind blew just so, he thought he saw a pale shadow standing at the edge of the trees, hair like a raven's wing, eyes full of endless night. She never spoke, never approached, only watched him with that terrible, gentle longing, as if part of her still clung to the world, unable to pass beyond the veil. Thomas would lower his head, whisper a prayer, and keep walking, for some souls cannot be saved. Some stories have no redemption, only a hush, like snow falling on old bones, until the world forgets.